In neighborhoods stitched together by similar roofs and shared mailboxes, small lives intersect in ways that are often invisible until someone decides to look. Maple Grove was one such place. Rows of modest houses spaced with neat lawns, a playground anchored beneath two aging oaks, and a community center that hosted potlucks and cautious meetings. The homeowners prided themselves on order and the quiet comfort of routine. There was an expectation, unspoken but understood, that the shared public life would be tidy and predictable. Beneath that tidy surface, however, were countless tender threads, acts of care, quiet acts of rescue, and stray kindnesses that only a few people noticed until a complaint made them painfully visible. I could see the heart of one small but growing storm was a cat. Not a pedigree, not a flash of exotic fur paraded for accolades, but a streetwise, gray-striped tabby with a scar along one ear and eyes that moved like a patient wind. The cat had a way of appearing where consolation was needed. It showed up at porches at dusk and slept on porches during rainy afternoons. It sat by the feet of those who gardened alone, nudging them into a softer posture of attention. It lay on heat vents in winter and chased storms of fallen leaves with the serious playfulness that only animals know how to perform. Children dubbed the cat Patch for the mark on its ear, and the name stuck. Parents watched as tired toddlers discovered unexpected calm in Patch's company. Teenagers, who often felt invisible at the edges of adult lives, found in Patch a small responsibility. They left saucers of milk and took turns sweeping crumbs for porches. Elderly residents, whose companionship options had thinned with time, found in Patch a patient listener to the stories they repeated and a warm weight on their laps that made loneliness less sharp. Single parents appreciated the cat's quiet presence, which sometimes allowed a moment of rest while a child drifted into nap. For many, Patch was a small, steady companion, part guardian, part therapy, part neighbor. Not everyone noticed Patch the same way. There were those who passed on their morning walks without a glance, and others who would never allow an animal near their trimmed hedges. Then there was Karen, a woman whom the neighborhood noticed quickly for her crisp nails, sharper opinions, and a sense of propriety that she deemed non-negotiable. Karen liked rules because they clarified what to expect. There were maps in a world she found otherwise cluttered and unpredictable. She kept her driveway immaculate, her fence trimmed to exacting heights, and her complaints neatly filed when anything disturbed her curated view. Patch drifted to Karen's end of the street one summer afternoon and made the mistake, in Karen's eyes, of poking at the fresh mulch in her front yard. The cat's paw brushed a squirrel-shaped gnome's hat, scattering a few chips of mulch. It was small enough to be dismissed by most people, but not by Karen. For her, the act was symbolic, an invasion of order by an animal she considered untethered and thus untrustworthy. So when the cat reappeared the next week on her porch step, rubbing its face on the doorframe and leaving faint specks of paw prints, something in her tightened into action. That Karen's complaints began as notes left in tidy envelopes at the neighborhood association office, formal, brisk, and precise. She enumerated grievances. The cat was a nuisance. It dug up flower beds. It left feces near her walkway, and it was a potential hazard to children. The language was measured so that it read like civic responsibility rather than personal irritation. When those notes produced no immediate result, she documented sightings with photos and times, making a habit of collecting tiny evidences that fed into a picture where the cat was a public annoyance that needed addressing. The Homeowners Association, with its gentle hierarchy and a clipboard of bylaws, responded the way associations often do, with letters that balanced neighborly courtesy with official firmness. A notice requested that the cat be kept off private property and reminded residents that feeding strays was discouraged per community guidelines. The notice was intended to be simple, a preventive nudge toward consensus. For most residents, it was a reminder to be mindful. They received it and kept living the way they always had, placing a saucer of milk here, a dry food bowl there, with the furtive understanding that small acts of kindness sometimes required bending strictures. But Karen did not relent. Her notes continued to arrive, more structured and more insistent. She began to attend association meetings with a stack of printouts and appointed presents. Her complaint was not merely about a cat. It was about the principle of order. Whenever the word nuisance moved into formal complaints, the machinery of the HOA took notice. Some members, who were new to the role of small governance enforcers, felt validated by the chance to act decisively. Others, who had once volunteered at shelters or who had elderly relatives that relied on neighbors in emergencies, felt uneasy about punishing what looked like an animal needing care. Patch, oblivious to bylaws and the humane complexities of suburban bureaucracy, continued to visit the people who needed it most. The cat turned up at Mrs. Ellison's porch consistently, settling onto the quilt she spread when she sorted letters, as if it understood that old hands like to be busy with small tasks and that company softened afternoon aches. It brushed the ankles of Mr. Ramirez, who baked bread in the basement for the food bank and once, when he had a cold winter night with no one to clear his gutters, had found consolation with a neighbor who had a van and an afternoon to spare. The cat became a node in an informal safety net, alerting residents to each other's needs because its presence naturally led to conversations, brief, soft, and human, which often developed into offers of help as the complaint file swelled. The neighborhood's mood subtly shifted. Conversations at the bus stop and in grocery lines grew quieter when the cat was mentioned. Some residents muttered about civility and responsibilities. Others felt a moral tug that made them uneasy to defend a stray against an organized complaint. Patch itself was unaware that it had become a subject of policy and committees. It continued to perform the small ministry of being present, faithful without ceremony. In doing so, the cat exposed the community's fault lines between rules and care, between the letter of the law and the compassion behind it, between the impulse to maintain appearances and the acts that made appearances matter less than the people beneath them. The HOA convened a subcommittee to consider the repeated complaints. They followed procedure. They documented occurrences, scheduled a review, and planned to issue an ultimatum: either keep the cat on private property or face removal actions. The language they used was clinical. The intent was simple: to restore a perceived order. What the language failed to capture, however, was the reservoir of quiet dependence that many residents had come to place in the cat's presence. Patch continued its rounds, unaware of the letter that would soon be delivered to every doorstep, unaware of how its ordinary movements had unsettled assumptions about what a community could be. Meanwhile, in living rooms and on porches, neighbors began to choose sides without always realizing the implications. Some prepared to protect what they had always known, a small, ragged comfort that made long, difficult days softer. Others sharpened their sense of the public good as an aesthetic, ready to align with regulations that define neatness as safety. The stage was set. A single creature, moving through yards and hearts with no interest in bylaws, had become the axis around which the neighborhood's values would be tested. If the association acted, how would the neighborhood respond? Would compassion outweigh compliance? Would the stories of warmth attached to a stray cat be strong enough to alter the path of official procedure? The tension hummed in Sunday porches, in the careful tightening of envelopes, and in the slow, steady breaths of those who had come to rely on a small gray cat for reasons that had nothing to do with rules. When the HOA's ultimatum arrived, it did more than instruct. It forced people to make a choice about what mattered most. And in the quiet that followed the notice, as Patch slept in the sun on a child's discarded blanket, the neighborhood found itself at the beginning of a reckoning that would test its heart as much as its bylaws. In the morning, neatly folded inside envelopes slid with mechanical precision into each mailbox. The notices looked like every other formal correspondence: thin, white, rigid, holding the sterile weight of a decision that had not yet met the heart of the people it would affect. The letterhead announced the Homeowners Association's authority. The text beneath announced the problem. The neighborhood stray, Patch, was deemed a continuing nuisance, and action would now be taken if residents did not comply with strict new rules. The letter instructed that no resident was to feed or shelter the cat. Any food, bedding, or makeshift shelter found outdoors would incur fines. Residents were advised to discourage the animal's presence and report sightings immediately. And finally, the line that made the neighborhood fall eerily still. The HOA would coordinate with animal control to remove the stray if its presence persisted. The phrasing was clinical, cold, and efficient, utterly disconnected from the emotional threads Patch had woven through the community. It framed a living creature as an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. But for many in Maple Grove, Patch was anything but a problem. The letter did not anticipate the effect it would have. It did not anticipate the tremor it would send through doorways, over fences, and down the quiet paths of people's lives. The first hint of trouble came in the uneasy hush that settled across Maple Grove. Parents stood at their mailboxes, scanning the notice with tightening brows. Elderly residents read slowly, mouthing the words as their hearts sank. Children, too young to understand the bureaucratic weight of an ultimatum but old enough to sense loss, noticed the tension in their parents' shoulders. Neighbors exchanged glances that held more questions than answers, but no reaction rippled harder or faster than the moment Mrs. Ellison, the widowed resident who spent afternoons on her porch sorting letters, placed the notice on her lap. She squinted at the paragraph describing Patch as a persistent disruption. Her thin fingers trembled as she recalled how the cat had slept by her feet on the nights her grief felt sharpest. The idea of losing that quiet companionship, one of the few comforts in her slow, tender days, felt like losing her husband all over again. She folded the notice neatly and placed it beside her. Then, with a resolve she had not felt in years, she stood and went to her neighbor's door. Her knock was the first domino. One by one, other neighbors followed suit, carrying their notices into conversations that built momentum and emotion. Stories began tumbling forth, stories that Karen and the HOA had never bothered to know. That a young mother spoke of Patch curling around her ankles while she rocked her baby to sleep on the porch, easing the loneliness of parenting alone. A retired man recounted the winter when Patch had stayed beside him after a fall on the ice until help arrived, the cat's patience anchoring him through the fear. Teens shared how Patch waited near the bus stop on cold mornings, giving them a sense of familiarity at an age where everything else felt uncertain. Each story was a thread, and the threads began to braid themselves into something formidable. Still, Patch had no understanding of the stir its existence caused. That morning, the cat moved through Maple Grove with its usual slow, deliberate steps, stretching in sunbeams, blinking at passing cars, pausing to sit on warm patches of sidewalk. Children rushed to pet it before their parents hurried them along, anxious but unsure how to explain the fine line between compassion and rules. Patch blinked with gentle ignorance, curling its tail around ankles in greeting. Karen, meanwhile, felt triumphant. She stood at her window with a satisfaction she rarely experienced, watching as the neighborhood shifted with the weight of her efforts. She believed she had restored order. For her, the cat represented disarray, unpredictability, and removing it meant regaining control. She assumed the neighborhood would ultimately accept the HOA's decision because rules, in her mind, existed to be respected, not questioned. But Karen misunderstood Maple Grove. She misunderstood what people silently relied on, what bound them together beneath the polite surfaces and hedges trimmed to regulatory perfection. She did not anticipate that her insistence on order would become the spark that united a community against her cause. Late that afternoon, the HOA office began receiving calls, dozens within the first hour. Some were polite, some trembling with emotion, some firm in their disappointment. Residents questioned the decision. They challenged the logic. They demanded reconsideration. The HOA, unaccustomed to pushback, treated each call like a surprising ripple in still water. When the calls did not slow, emails began pouring in. Residents filled inboxes with personal stories, photographs of Patch curled on porches, and heartfelt explanations of why the cat meant so much. A family sent a picture of Patch sitting beside their daughter as she recovered from a broken leg, the cat's warmth easing her restlessness. A widower wrote about how Patch's presence gave him the courage to step outside each morning after losing his spouse. Then something unexpected happened at a group of children, none older than 12, gathered in the cul-de-sac with handmade signs. Their crayons had pressed hard on a poster board, forming uneven letters that read, "Save Patch, he's our friend, and please don't take him." Their small voices grew louder, cracks of emotion swelling into something bigger than they had anticipated. Parents watched from doorsteps, their faces softened, conflicted, and proud. The neighborhood had cracked open, revealing a depth of care the HOA had never imagined. For the first time in years, people stood together not for a holiday, not for a gathering, but for a shared moral cause. And Karen noticed. Her window, once a place of judgment, became a frame for something unfamiliar, unity that did not include her. She watched the children, her expression tightening. She watched the neighbors gathering in clusters, sharing stories she had never heard. Voices rose, not in anger, but in collective heartbreak. A community she believed was silent and compliant was now stirring with purpose that Karen's satisfaction thinned. She had always believed the rules protected the neighborhood, but now she sensed that perhaps something else had always protected it. Something softer, something human, something she had not understood. As dusk settled, the HOA began drafting a follow-up announcement, sensing they could not ignore the swelling unrest. But the divide between order and humanity had already been drawn across the lawns and sidewalks of Maple Grove. Patch curled up on the porch of the Ramirez family home, unaware of the tidal shift its small life had created. As the first stars flickered overhead and porch lights buzzed to life, the neighborhood braced for what would come next. Because one thing was now clear, this was no longer about a cat.it, was about the heart of Maple Grove, and the battle for what kind of community it wanted to be E.by the next morning. Maple Grove was no longer the quiet, predictable neighborhood it had been just days earlier. Something had awakened, something that had been dormant beneath polite waves and manicured hedges. The ultimatum about Patch had unsettled the roots of the community, stirring people who had lived side by side for years without ever needing to take a collective stand. The HOA office, typically calm and sparsely visited, now felt like the center of a storm. Residents arrived in a steady stream, clutching copies of the notice or carrying folders filled with childhood drawings, phone photos, or small keepsakes connected to Patch. They came not with hostility, but with conviction. Their faces carried the unmistakable weight of protectiveness, an instinct that surprised even them. Inside the office, the board members tried to maintain rigid professionalism, but their composure began to crack as the hours passed. Their tidy space, organized with framed policies and carefully arranged brochures, was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of human stories pouring through the door. An elderly man with trembling hands placed a photograph of Patch on the counter. The picture showed the cat curled on his lap while he rested in a wheelchair after surgery. With a soft, weathered voice, he described how the cat had sensed his pain long before he could articulate it, settling against him in the evenings to keep him warm. Patch, he said, was not a nuisance. Patch was healing. A young mother arrived next, her toddler perched on her hip. She shared how Patch often sat with her child during the long afternoons when exhaustion weighed heavily on her. She explained how her son's anxiety calmed when Patch was near, how laughter returned to their home at moments when she feared it was slipping away. Teenagers came in pairs, holding up their phones and showing videos of Patch visiting the bus stop, waiting with them on mornings when school felt overwhelming. Some of them spoke about mental health struggles no one had known they battled. Moments when Patch's quiet companionship had grounded them when nothing else could. The HOA board members listened, their expressions shifting from neutrality to discomfort, and then, in some cases, to shame. They had made their decision based on lines in a handbook, never considering that a stray cat had woven itself into the emotional fabric of the neighborhood in ways that protocol could never measure. Meanwhile, outside the office, the movement grew. Parents gathered with strollers. Teenagers painted more signs. Retirees sat on folding chairs beneath umbrellas, keeping a peaceful vigil. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now shared stories, coffee, and purpose. It was as if Patch had revealed the hidden connections among them, threads that were always present but had never been pulled together until now. Every few minutes, someone would kneel to pet Patch, who wandered contentedly among the crowd, brushing against legs and curling into laps. The cat seemed unaware of the conflict but fully aware of the affection surrounding it, basking in the warmth of people whose emotions had converged like a tide. Inside her home, Karen watched the gathering with a mix of disbelief and frustration. Her complaints had never generated such response, nor had she ever seen the neighborhood rally over any issue. She felt the sting of isolation, not because she wanted the cat removed for cruelty's sake, but because she believed strongly in order, cleanliness, and predictability. Patch represented what she could not control. But now, as she observed the collective support forming like a protective barrier around the cat, she felt something else, a flicker of doubt. She had never understood Patch's significance beyond its inconvenience. She had never asked why people loved it. She had never listened. Still, Karen's pride held firm. She convinced herself that the neighborhood was acting emotionally, irrationally, that rules existed precisely to prevent sentimental chaos. Yet beneath that insistence was a quieter question she could not ignore. Had she been wrong? The HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting that evening, hoping to regain control of the situation. They met in the community center, a room usually filled with soft chatter and casual gatherings. Now it felt wired with tension, every fluorescent light flickering like an exclamation point. Residents flooded the room, standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls and spilling into the hallway. They held photos of Patch, personal letters, and stories waiting to be heard. The board members' usual confidence seemed to shrink under the weight of so many watching eyes. Before the board could even begin, people stepped forward. One by one, they shared what Patch meant to them. Not with anger, but with deeply human vulnerability. A grieving father spoke of how Patch appeared the first morning after his wife passed away, sitting on the porch as if offering quiet company, when the world had felt unbearably hollow. A teenager, normally withdrawn, shared how Patch had become the one consistent comfort during his struggle with depression. A nurse in the neighborhood described how Patch visited the seniors she cared for, bringing joy that medicine couldn't replicate. These weren't trivial attachments. They were lifelines, and as the testimonies continued, the air in the room shifted. Even the board members felt emotions rising within them, emotions they could no longer dismiss. Then, unexpectedly, Karen entered. The room quieted. Faces turned. People waited. She walked with stiff determination, carrying her own copy of the HOA ultimatum. But when she reached the center of the room, she hesitated, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The firmness in her posture softened as she looked at the residents, not with irritation, but with something closer to confusion, even vulnerability. For the first time, Karen saw not a group defying order, but a community united in love for something small, wounded, and gentle. A community whose need for Patch came from a place she had never allowed herself to access. In their faces, she saw grief, loneliness, healing, and connection, feelings she rarely acknowledged in herself. Although she didn't speak, her presence alone carried the weight of change. The board, sensing the tide turning around them, realized that enforcing the ultimatum now risked fracturing the neighborhood beyond repair. The rule was losing its meaning in the face of something much greater: human compassion. The meeting continued late into the evening, voices merging into a collective plea for understanding. And when the board finally adjourned, the community sensed something had shifted, not officially, not yet, but in spirit. Outside, Patch curled up under a warm porch light near the gathering crowd. Residents lingered, whispering hopes that the board would choose empathy over regulation. Children stroked Patch's fur. Adults exchanged quiet glances of determination. The air carried the weight of anticipation. The final decision loomed ahead, a decision that would determine whether Maple Grove would cling to rigid order or embrace the heart that Patch had helped them rediscover. And as the moon rose and settled over the cul-de-sac, the cat slept peacefully, unaware that the future of the neighborhood and the lessons it needed to learn rested gently on its small, steady presence. Morning in Maple Grove carried a strange, suspended stillness, one that sat between fear and hope. The sun rose over driveways and rooftops like a gentle breath, warming the dew on lawns where neighbors had stood united the night before. Everyone knew today was pivotal. The HOA's final decision would determine not only Patch's fate, but what kind of community Maple Grove truly was. Patch, unaware of the tension it inspired, stretched across a porch railing and blinked lazily at the world. It wandered slowly down the sidewalk, brushing its body against familiar legs, pausing near the bench where teenagers gathered each morning. Some residents stroked its fur with trembling hands, uncertain whether these would be their last moments with the neighborhood's quiet guardian. Children hugged their signs from yesterday's gathering, while parents maintained steady smiles that masked heavy concern. Inside the HOA office, the board members met earlier than usual. The atmosphere was thick with discomfort. They carried binders, papers, and copies of the rules, but their usual certainty had dimmed. The evidence of community support for Patch had become impossible to ignore. Their inboxes overflowed with messages. Their voicemail was full. Their office had become a place of reckoning. Most importantly, something had shifted within the board members themselves. The coldness with which they had initially handled the complaints seemed almost ridiculous now. They realized they were facing not an issue of property standards, but a matter of emotional truth, something no rulebook had ever prepared them to address. At the center of the table sat the ultimatum: remove the cat or revoke the order. The board president, who had always prided herself on decisiveness, felt her hands tremble slightly as she held the paper. She wondered, perhaps for the first time in her career as a neighborhood gatekeeper, whether enforcing order could sometimes cause more harm than good. Meanwhile, outside, residents began gathering again, not with anger, but with quiet determination. They carried coffee for one another, stood in clusters of shared hope, and watched the office door with a reverence usually given to courtrooms. It didn't matter that this wasn't an official governmental decision. Maple Grove felt like it was standing at a moral crossroads. Patch trotted between groups, its tail swaying like a slow-moving metronome, as if keeping time for their beating hearts. When it hopped onto Mrs. Ellison's lap, the elderly woman wrapped her arms around it, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She whispered promises the cat could not understand. Behind her, neighbors placed reassuring hands on her shoulders. Even Karen watched from her porch, though she stayed apart from the crowd. For the first time, she no longer felt righteous. She felt exposed, seen not as a protector of order, but as someone who had unintentionally wounded her community. The sight of residents standing together for Patch stirred something in her chest, something she had long forgotten how to feel. When the office door finally opened, a hush washed over the gathered crowd. The board members stepped outside, papers in hand. Their expressions were serious, but not rigid. They looked humbled, changed. The board president approached the top of the community center steps and took a steady breath. She glanced down at Patch, curled beside the feet of a small circle of children, its eyes half closed as if the world around it was nothing but softness. And then, with a tone lighter and wiser than the neighborhood had ever heard from her, she announced the decision. The HOA would revoke the ultimatum. Patch would not be removed. The community's emotional needs, compassion, and united voice had outweighed the concerns of a few. But the announcement didn't stop there. The board declared a new initiative, Maple Grove Community Compassion Guidelines, a policy designed not to enforce stricter rules, but to protect the acts of kindness and emotional bonds that made the neighborhood more than just aligned fences and matching mailboxes. Patch, though technically a stray, would be recognized as a community emotional support animal. Residents would be allowed to feed it in designated areas. The HOA would even fund a small shelter for Patch during winter month. As the words washed over the crowd, something beautiful happened, and a wave of relief overtook Maple Grove. Not loud, not wild, but deeply felt. Tears, quiet laughter, and heartfelt embraces rippled through the group. Children cheered and ran to Patch, who blinked in mild confusion as it became the center of sudden, overwhelming affection. Elderly neighbors smiled through watery eyes. Parents exchanged looks of relief. Even stoic residents softened. Patch, ever calm, allowed itself to be adored. Then, something no one expected occurred. Karen stepped forward. Her walk was hesitant, uncertain, but deliberate, each step marking a small surrender of pride. Neighbors turned, unsure what she would say or do. The woman who had initiated the conflict, who had insisted on order over compassion, who had unknowingly placed a beloved animal in danger, now stood at the heart of the very community she had been at odds with. She did not speak. She knelt instead. With a trembling hand, she reached out to touch Patch's fur. The cat regarded her with slow, curious eyes before nudging its head gently against her palm. The gesture broke something open inside her. Karen's posture softened, her shoulders lowered, and for the first time in years, her expression held something other than rigid certainty. What had begun as a battle for control had become a lesson, one she had resisted until the truth stood undeniable. Rules meant nothing without humanity. Neighbors watched as Karen wiped the corner of her eye. And in that vulnerable moment, she joined the community she had kept at arm's length for so long. In the weeks that followed, Maple Grove changed subtly but profoundly. Patch became a fixture, an ambassador of unity. Residents built the small shelter behind the community center, decorating it with flowers and a sign that read Patch's Place. Children took turns filling its food bowl. Seniors came to sit beside it for comfort. The cat visited Karen's porch too, curling up near her feet as she watered her plants. She learned not just to tolerate the little creature, but to appreciate its silent companionship. The neighborhood grew closer. People spoke more freely. Compassion became louder than rules. And the board, once rigid, embraced a kinder understanding of community. As for Patch, life continued on its simple course, moving porch to porch, lap to lap, heart to heart, leaving warmth wherever it rested. And Maple Grove, awakened by the small, steady presence of a stray cat, discovered something extraordinary. Sometimes it takes the smallest life to remind a community how big its heart can be.